Ellsworth Callis was a preacher and a teacher. He was pastor of a church in First United Methodist Church in Cleveland, Ohio for many, many years, and has written many, many books. Dr. Callis passed away a few years ago at the young age of, I believe it was 90. He lived a long and fruitful life and spent the last years of his active ministry as the acting president of Asbury Theological Seminary and one of the preaching teachers there. In his commentary that he had written about Isaac, and his a book that I had online today that was looking at Genesis, and his chapter was on Isaac. He said that to him, the book of Genesis could be seen as a great symphony, and how symphonies seem to have, as we all know that have listened to symphonies, that they have different movements. And he said in the first movement is usually very strong and powerful and really moves you with its strength. He says the third movement is that which brings us to conclusion and so on and so forth. But the second movement is often very quiet and contemplative and reflective. And he said when you look at the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is said over and over again in the scripture and in the referring to the patriarchs, Abraham is the first movement. Jacob / Israel is the third movement, and Isaac is the second movement. Of all of the patriarchs, fewer chapters are dedicated to Isaac. Fewer things are said, but that doesn't mean that Isaac and Rebekah and their two boys who never got along, that they are any less important in the scripture, because of the journey through this family. Now, I always like to try and start and see if you have any questions that in your reading or stuff that you did in your research that you'd like to bring up, and we can start there and then move into some other stuff that I've made some notes on this evening. Any questions from your reading this week? Any thoughts? Or yeah, anything that struck you as you were reading?
I was sort of struck by the fact that they all seem to go back to the home place to get their wives.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if for some reason that area of the country was more monotheistic than Canaan was at that point.
Because Canaan clearly was not. They had all kinds of gods, and Baal and Asherah, and I would think that would be one reasonable explanation. Yeah. One of the other explanations that I wrote down, I remember, and of course this is way, way, way down further in the history of Israel. Remember when Solomon had multiple wives? He had all kinds, what you're talking about, and I didn't look it up, so I don't have the number, but hundreds of wives. And the people, especially the religious leaders, rebelled against that and said that he shouldn't be doing this. And that's because one of the things about the culture in ancient Israel is the woman determined the religion of the family. So you're exactly right, Joanne. The going back to find people who believe like we believe is critically important, because for Isaac to marry a Hittite woman, which that comes up a little bit later, would compromise not only the family, but it would compromise the religion of the family. So I think you were right on target there. So other thoughts, things you've read, things that jumped out at you? Now, here's a question that I have never had an answer for. when Abraham has his servant swear that he's going to go and find Rebekah, he has him put his hand under his thigh as a sign of an oath. Why under the thigh? And I seriously am saying, I've never found anything that told me that. Now, if you have, that's great, because I'd love to learn. But and this is not the only time it happens. It happens a few other times, and why is it? It's not cross my heart, hope to die, that kind of thing, or hand on the Bible, because the Bible didn't exist then. But hand under the thigh. Yes.
What verse is it in?
I read that too.
It is verse 9, chapter 24, verse 9.
Because my book has it. It says, I'll have to look. The placing of one's hand under the thigh of another may have indicated submission to that person's strength and authority. In any case, by undertaking this action, the servant binds himself to obey Abraham's request.
Okay. That's thank you. That's one of the things I've never, in all the time I've been doing this, have never found an explanation of that particular verse. I'm glad we don't have to do that now. Court would look a little funny.
Personal space.
What's that, Tava?
Personal space, thank you.
That's right. Personal space, thank you indeed. Okay. All right. Now, what's interesting is, as you all know, the sermon from this past Sunday was the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. So I had, you can never get all of the points in one particular passage, so you have to grab a point and go with it. But there are several things that are here. Any other questions or observations in the chapter 24 or 25 or 27 that you read?
Grab by the heel means to deceive.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. It's in one of the footnotes. I had looked at that today, and Jacob, the name Jacob means one who grabs by the heel or the deceiver. So Jacob's name tells you about him before anything else.
I've always been felt sorry for Esau.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his birthright, his blessing.
Right. Yeah. And I had a professor once, or some teacher in some context I was in, who said to me, "Do you really think that Isaac was fooled? Or was this something that Isaac played along with Rebekah in giving Jacob the blessing rather than because it's kind of like, I know my child's voice. I know, and I don't have two, but for those of you who have multiple children, don't you know your children's voice? So it's kind of like, so this was one of my professors said that they were wondering if Isaac was complicit in Rebekah's plot, as well as rather than just being taken advantage of. So that's once again a question we can't answer. But
yeah, my commentary said that he was somewhat culpable.
Okay.
The phrase, and it went on to say that they thought that Isaac knew that Esau had sold his birthright.
Okay. Now, and see, that's what's interesting is they have two different phrases here. It is, he sells his birthright for a bowl of stew, and then he misses out on his blessing. Birthright is what gives you ownership of property. That's the front door of if you use the parable of the prodigal son, when the second son comes in and he's angry with his dad for throwing a party for his younger brother, the father says to him, everything I have is yours. And that's the law of the time. He had already given 1/3 of his property to the prodigal, and then the prodigal had gone off and blown it. When the father says to the disgruntled older son, everything that I have is yours, he's saying, you know, that nothing is going to change in that department. So with the birthright, because he's when there were multiple children in the time of Jesus, the oldest got 2/3 of the property, and then the youngest got 1/3. In the time of Abraham and Isaac, the one who has the blessing, who has the birthright, gets the property. And that's something you'll see a little bit later. You see later on in chapter 27. Isaac gives Jacob all the property, all of the cows and sheep and goats and everything else, and then he gives all of his other children gifts. Or at least that's what my translation said. So when they come in for the reading of the will, the attorney says, I give unto Isaac all that I possess, and I give unto my other children this really nice set of cufflinks, and, you know, and so on and so on. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. So this is a really dysfunctional family, you know, a really dysfunctional family.
What is the blessing? When he gives him the blessing, what is he giving him?
Well, yeah, let's jump over to that here real quick. It's in chapter 27 of Genesis. And the blessing the blessing gives him all the property, and also proclaims him as the quote unquote king. They don't use those words, but what he says is, let me find it here real quick.
Well, the birthright was the privilege of having that property, right?
Right. And the blessing is what confirms it. Well,
It's just word of mouth then. It's just word of mouth.
And it was witnessed by mom, you know, because Rebecca was right there.
But it's still just word of mouth.
Right.
Well, he inherits everything.
Yeah.
It's inheritance.
By word of mouth.
Uh-huh.
Now, it doesn't say anything's written down or anything. It's just, I give it to you.
No, yeah. Well, and it wasn't only that. It was also in chapter 27, verse 29, he says, or 28, he says, may God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and the plenty of grain. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So he's setting him up he's setting him up as the top of the heap. And, you know,
he's passed on God's promise.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And that's where Esau just, you know, loses it, is, you know, he's doing exactly what his father had asked him to do. And then Rebecca, you know, doggone. If I'm Esau, I don't think I'm trusting mom a whole lot. You know?
Well, you know, my book pointed out that Esau had married a Hittite, which had caused grief to the two of them.
Yep.
So maybe that was a factor.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Hittites were hated enemies of of the clan of Abraham, and yeah, the Hittites were. Okay. Other thoughts, questions as we?
I always thought that Jacob was the one that was supposed to have the blessing, but Esau was. Esau was as I reread this, Esau's the one that's supposed to have the blessing.
All right.
And I always thought it was Jacob. I don't know why I had that in my mind.
Well, it's interesting, Louise. There was something. Well, I said last week. I swear I was taught that Abraham and Sarah were called from the Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan, and that's not what the Bible says. It says God called Abraham's father to bring his family to Haran, and then from Haran, Abraham and Sarah which is north Israel. From Haran, Abraham and Sarah are called to go down into Canaan. And I swear to goodness, I've been taught all my life what I would, the previous rather than the latter. So it's interesting when you read it. But yeah, Jacob stole Esau's. And when we study Jacob next week, we'll see how Jacob and Esau. Well, I'll give you the precursor. Okay. Jacob runs from Esau because Esau has basically said, hey, after the mourning period for Dad's death, I'm going to kill you. So Jacob runs from Esau. And then when he comes back a very wealthy and powerful man, and he meets Esau, and he says, here's a part of what I have so that we'll be at peace. Is that okay with you? And Esau says, well, okay, let's be at peace. And then Jacob says, now you go ahead of me and I'll come a little bit later. And then he never does. Jacob is a rascal. And I had a friend of mine once who said, Jacob is proof that God can use a rascal. That no, you don't have to be perfect to be used by God, that God can use a rascal too. Other thoughts, questions? All right. One of the things, when I said I read some of the commentary by Ellsworth Callis. Let's go back to chapter 24 of Genesis. And this is the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. For whatever reason, and Joanne, you're probably right. It probably is the religious reason. Abraham is saying, hey, you can't marry any of the girls around here. Go back and find someone from my family. And then the servant does. Now, interestingly, tradition names the servant, but the Bible doesn't. The Bible doesn't name the servant at all. But the servant says, I'm going to go, and he sets up, he casts a fleece before the Lord. And he says, for the person I'm looking for, please, when I say, may I have something to drink, she'll say this, and she'll say, yes, you may, and then I'll also take care of your camels. And that's the picture, this was the picture that was taken when he showed up, and that's Rebekah. You know what, Nancy? Rebekah looks kind of white for Middle East. It's the picture, right?
That's Jesus.
One of the things that somebody pointed out to me was that and I mentioned it in the sermon on Sunday, the being willing to do watering of the camels, and he had taken along, let me look here, because it said how many camels he took. Took 10 camels. If you think about how much water a thirsty camel would drink, and this is somebody, Rebekah turns out is somebody who is willing to work hard in order to care for people, in order to care for animals. And because that would be putting a lot of water. out so the camels could drink. So it's that. It tells you something about who she is. It tells you something about her work ethic. It tells you something about her compassion, because it's not just here, have a drink. It's also here, let me also take care of your animals. So it tells you something about the basic character of the person at first meeting. Now, in every season, there is something that we use to mark that we are in a potential relationship with somebody. In this particular case, when she said that he thought he had found the right person, it says as soon as let me go up a little further because I found it one place, that he gives her a nose ring and a bunch of bracelets. When I was a teenager, if you were going with somebody and you had a senior ring, you gave it to them and they wrapped it in fuzzy yarn. That was the nose ring and bracelets of our day. So it said when the camels had finished. This is verse 22 of chapter 24. When camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, "Tell me whose daughter you are," and gives her these gifts. Any questions up to that point? And
why would he give them to her when? I mean, he just met her. He just met her. Why would he give her the rings then? Because later
she made the commitment.
Right.
Not at that point. She hadn't done anything but water the camels.
Well, does that come before where she said
in a 22nd verse, after the camels had finished drinking, that the man took a golden nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrist weighing 10 shekels of gold.
But wasn't that the sign that the servant asked God to provide him, that the woman would be that kind and compassionate to water, and then also to water the camels? And so when he found that woman and she did those things, that was how he knew that was the right one.
Right. And that's how he was marking her. He was saying,
marking her.
Here, wear this nose ring and wear these bracelets, and let's go talk to your family.
It was an engagement nose ring.
That's right. It was an engagement nose ring. Yeah. Or at least it was the opening. It was the opening negotiation of the contract. That's for sure. So Rebecca takes the servant, unnamed, to meet her father and her brothers, and they go through. And see, the other thing is, in the ancient world, and still in many parts of this world, there are no. You don't have the convenience of falling in love.
Right.
Weddings are arranged. The first trip I took to Israel, there was somebody that was with us on the bus, and one of the Bedouins in the area where we were stopping, one of the Bedouins offered who he thought was this woman's father 10 camel for the woman on the bus. it was kind of like, no. And so it still happens in many cultures today that they are prearranged and contract. Now, she had the option to say no, and the servant had said to Abraham, "Oh, what if she says no?" And Abraham had said, "If she says no, you're released from this obligation, and you can go do whatever you need to do." But Laban. Let me make sure. Laban's the father, I guess. Laban and Bethuel, the brother, enter into a negotiation, and the servant says, "Hey, I want you to know my Abraham and my master is very, very, very wealthy, and he has only one son, and the one son's going to be very, very wealthy, and we'd like for Rebecca to be his wife." And they make a deal. Now, what's interesting, and this is it says that if you go all the way down to verse 65 or 64, it says, "And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, 'Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us?' The servant said, 'It is my master.' So she took her veil and covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. Wonderful place to spend your honeymoon is in your dead mother's tent. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." Ellsworth Callis said, "We don't know whether it was love at first sight, but what we do know is it was marriage at first sight." Yeah, because that's the first, they come and she becomes Mrs. Isaac at that point.
My book says it was divinely directed.
Okay.
To work that way, that he would be the first that she would see.
Uh-huh. I find it really, the whole story is interesting. Now, if you go to chapter 25, which I didn't have you read these verses of chapter 25, Abraham gets married again and has several more children. But the only person who gets the inheritance is Isaac. Okay. And this is the verse that I got kind of tickled at. He said, "Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country." All of his kids that he had by his concubines and others, he says, "Here, take this and go live somewhere else, because Isaac's going to be in charge." All right. Abraham dies, and then by the end of the chapter, we're down here with Esau and Jacob. Ellsworth Callis had pointed out he loved to paraphrase things. He says, "The pregnancy was quite difficult, however, so difficult that Rebecca said, 'If this is what it's like, why did it happen to me?'" That's that passage when it says, if it is to be this way, this is the 22nd verse. "The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is to be this way, why do I live?'" That must have been a really hard pregnancy. So this is where, when they are born, Esau, which his name is translated red, he came out hairy, and Jacob came out smooth. And Esau was born first, which would have given him all of the birthrights and everything else. And Jacob came out holding on to his heel. Okay. And as I said, the footnote is he takes by the heel, or he supplants. He deceives at that point. Now, what's interesting is their entire childhood is 2 verses.
Mm-hmm.
When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Interesting that they had favorites. Okay. So, any questions or any thoughts at this point? Anything that came up? Now, one of the interesting things here is if you look at verse 30 of this chapter, it says, Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished. And the word Edom is, therefore he was called Edom, which is red. What's interesting is Edom was the name of one of the enemies of the Israelites. So, you know, this is one of those places where you see the first name of a country mentioned, where Esau, and I hope you saw it. I saw it when I was looking at it. Esau was so angry with his family. He had married 2 Hittite women. When he didn't get his blessing, he said, you know what? I'm going to marry Ishmael's daughter too. And Ishmael was, of course, the first son of Abraham. So, you know, there's some real family anger and dysfunction here. They really need therapy. So Esau sells his birthright. It shows how much his birthright was worth to him, because all he wanted was something to eat. And they gave him a bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose up and went his way. If your birthright doesn't mean any more than that, you know, you begin to ask, okay, what did it mean? You know, is Esau the kind of person that Isaac's going to want to give everything to? So, other thoughts about Jacob and Esau? Yeah, Kaylin?
I think it's interesting, going back to the point about their entire childhood and upbringing was simplified to 2 sentences. It really makes you wonder what transpired over the course of their entire lifetimes up until adulthood that may have added to some of those complexities of their relationships as adults, especially thinking about how parents favored one over the other and those interactions. I mean, that there had to be additional things mixed in there that brought us to where they were as adults.
Yeah, there would be. It would be interesting to think about that, because they are such different personalities, you know. So, okay. Other thoughts? Thank you. Appreciate that.
I thought the information about Jacob's name, meaning holding on to the heel, he came out of the womb holding on to the heel of his brother, that he held his brother back. He really held his brother back from realizing his full potential, from securing his birthright and the blessing of his father as the firstborn. And so, yes, Jacob was a rascal. He was the deceiver, but I thought that just was an interesting image.
Yep.
The heel. He just held his brother back in so many ways, and is so in many ways responsible for Esau rather feeling the way he feels. He feels betrayed, let down. He's angry. It's I feel sorry for him too.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the other translations of Jacob is he supplants, you know, and that's at every turn he could, he moved his brother aside so that he could get, you know, he was the supplanter, you know, and that's an interesting, and to speak frankly, I'd have hated him too. You know, because he would have just goofed up my family something terrible, you know, our relationship. So, yep. Other thoughts, input, questions? All right. A couple of things that I wanted to just point out in 26. They're just, you know, little bits of here and there, and they're nothing. King Abimelech and the Philistines, Isaac. Now, as we said last week, and this is another witness to it, verse 1 of chapter 26 starts off, now there was a famine in the land. Isaac, like his father before him, and the people who worked with him and lived with him and who were his family, they were shepherds. they were Bedouins. They moved wherever the food was. And if there's a famine in the land, then they go wherever the food is. And Abimelech makes a deal with him and says, hey, don't go down to Egypt, because that evidently that's one of the places that they would go, because of what, with the cycling of the Nile and the floods of the Nile, there were some very rich lands there. And Egypt was one of those places, but Abimelech says, no, why don't you come here and be with me, and we'll take care of you. And when they get to Gerar, Gerar, that's verse 6, the same thing happens with Isaac that happened with Abraham and Sarah. He says, please tell the king you're my sister, or else they're going to kill me in order to get you. And it's one of those like father, like son. And same kind of things happen where bad things begin to happen to the Philistines, and Abimelech says, why did you do this? And then he says, now don't any of y'all touch them, okay? Other thing that I thought was interesting, there is a mention in here of a couple of places that were named. And the one I want to find is because we have, let me find it here, because I marked it. Beersheba is, well, no, let me go up to verse 22 first. It says, he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things that a conquering political force would do is, if they took you over, they'd fill in your wells so that you couldn't come back to that place and have the water you needed to survive. So it says that they had filled in Abraham's wells. So Isaac begins to dig them up again. And the one place that he begins to do one place, and the herders say, hey, those are our wells. And then he moves somewhere else and digs more wells. And the herders who are there says, well, we can share that. And when they say that, verse 22, he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called the place Rehoboth, or broad places, or room. The oldest church west of the Appalachians, of the Alleghenies, is in Union, West Virginia, in Monroe County, and it is called Old Rehoboth. Okay, it's one of those things that if you have a chance to go, it's now under a pavilion that protects it. And when you go inside, it is as it was in the time of Francis Asbury, and it's the oldest church west of the Appalachians, Old Rehoboth. So when I saw that name, broad places or room. And then the other thing that is up here is, I'm checking my notes here. It says, and they went from there to Beersheba. And there's also in this, and I can't find it right away, an explanation of how Beersheba got its name. As you have probably figured out, the names of places are not, and the names of people are not by accident. If you look at verse 21, it says then they dug another well and they quarreled over that one also. So he called the place Sitnah, and Sitnah is translated enmity. They have enmity between them. And the first well that he dug that they quarreled over was called Esek, or contention. So these places get named because of things that happened there. And of course, some of these places still, you still can go and find where they were. So, and then down in verse 34 and 35 is where Esau did the most egregious of all the things that he could do. He married 2 Hittite women, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Now, how might they have done that? When you think about it, How is it that it made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah?
They didn't get to choose the wife.
No.
Which would have been their, according to the culture, that would have been the way to go.
Uh-huh.
Maybe they were always talking about their gods or something, or talking against the true God.
Uh-huh. I'm going to look at something here real quick. Now, they were certainly, it says that they were descendants of the Canaanites. So they would have all of the Canaan. Well, and it was also a different religion. Canaanite religion was fertility, was a fertility cult. And therefore they had different practices that they thought was tied into the fertility of the land and the cycles of the moon and the sun and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting, he makes them mad, makes things bitter for them. The other thing is this, is being a grandfather, I love to see my grandkids. And if somebody wanted to strike me in my heart, they would say, nope, can't do it. Sorry. Don't want them to be influenced by you. Don't want them to be around you. That would break my heart. And I think there are other things that Esau may have done because Esau was upset. But the blessing hadn't come yet. The blessing comes in the next chapter. Okay, we've talked a little bit about that. Any thoughts you've had about the blessing of Jacob and Esau? And Joanne, I do agree with you. I do think that Isaac had some complicity in this, because
I find it really confusing.
How so?
Well, like you said initially, it's hard for me to believe that he didn't know that was Jacob.
Right.
And then, so he also knew, didn't he, that Jacob was the promised one, that Esau was to serve Jacob.
Well, that's what he's going to say here in just a few minutes. When he does the blessing, he's going to say that. Yeah.
I just think it's an interesting dynamic that he would, the way it all transpired.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were talking earlier about distinguishing the sound of his voice. There's also a couple of verses where Isaac talks about the smell of his son. I feel like that kind of hints too that he actually is identifying the true identity because of the familiarity and being able to distinguish one from the other.
Right. Right. Well, and I would now, I do not know this from personal experience, but I think there would be a difference in feel between the skin of a lamb and somebody's hairy arm. No matter how hairy they are, I would think there would be a difference. So.
Didn't it say that Jacob had some clothes of Esau's on?
Right. That's what Rebecca said. Here, put on your brother's clothing.
Yeah.
So he sounded like Jacob, but he smelled like Esau.
Yeah, that's what he says.
But they did ask him,
yeah.
Who are you? Or however he worded it.
But Isaac preferred Esau.
Yes, Isaac preferred Esau.
Right.
So why wouldn't he say, I think it's really curious. Why wouldn't he question that was not Jacob?
Well,
I mean,
and it says he did. It says he did question, but Jacob said, "No, it's Esau. You know, your eyes aren't good, so it's Esau." And he talks him into it. And one of the other things that we need to remember when we're looking at the biblical text like this, one of the things that Genesis does is it takes us to explanations of things. It takes us to where there's an explanation that Esau is the ancestor of Edom. And Edom is one of the enemies of Israel, probably in the time that this is being written. By the time this is being written, Isaac is one of the patriarchs. They're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jacob is one of the patriarchs. We probably, this being written down probably isn't happening until after the Exodus, until after the children of Israel follow Moses up out of Egypt, because there were no stenographers following Abraham and his kids around. So now, I do have to say that people is still yet in the Middle East are really good at passing along the stories with remembering lots of detail and so on and so forth. But this is being written down after Jacob had become the ancestor, after the Joseph and his brothers, after the time of oppression in Egypt. So it's us talking about George Washington. I saw. Have any of you seen Hamilton on? What do you think, Caitlin?
Fantastic. We got to see it in Pittsburgh, and it was just so neat being able to kind of compare and contrast, seeing everything up close, the emotions, how expression filled all of the original cast is. I'm gonna have to watch it back a couple more times because I know there are more details, but highly recommend it.
We watched it Saturday night, and I like because I'm not a person into hip hop. It took me a while to get into it. But one of the things I read, if you know the story of Hamilton and this musical, Hamilton comes out being anti-slavery in the musical. Historically, Hamilton bought and sold slaves for his father-in-law. When you're writing about history a couple hundred years later, you had sometimes you have an accurate remembrance, and sometimes you don't. So, Caitlin, you were going to say?
Yeah, we have different, filters that we place on things. That's why I highly recommend reading Ron Chernow biography too, like as a complement to that, to have more of that historical accuracy. But just thinking about how we kind of personify leaders looking back in time. We have to read through some of this within kind of that context and that framework of kind of after the fact and how these things are interpreted. So
it's really hard to take it all apart and decide about Isaac, because this is somebody's interpretation of what happened, and maybe it was skewed to turn out the way the writer wanted it to turn out.
Well, and the fact that the childhood of Jacob and Esau is 2 verses.
Right.
We're absolutely sure there was more than that, but it's not in our text, Yeah,
it's not a biography.
No, Caitlin had a good point. We don't know what happened between the 2 brothers that ended up with them being. Now, do I believe that Jacob and Esau had enmity between each other? Yeah, I do. But yeah, it's something. This is all being written probably when Israel has settled in Canaan and is writing down the story of the people of Israel. So, all right. Other thoughts, questions? We're getting toward the end here.
At this point, whenever we are writing down the Old Testament, do the Israelites already have enmity with the Edomites? Is this something that they're trying to explain? Like, you know, we used to be family, and then there was like something that happened, and now there's a lot of bad blood, and we're considered mortal enemies.
Well, you can imagine, Kyle, when the Israelites got to Canaan and told everybody that God had given them this land. You know, y'all have to move. This is ours. You can imagine, and it even tells us there were lots of wars that went on between the king of Moab and the king of Edom, and so yeah, they are doing that as well. Well, guys, thank you. I hope that this hour is worthwhile for you and that you're learning something. I've enjoyed preparing for it, reading the scriptures over again, because invariably there'll be something in there that I didn't see and have spent the last 40-some years of my life not seeing. So thanks very much for being a part of this.